So I discovered John Mulvihill one night when I was up really late because I couldn't sleep. I decided to look on Ancestry.com for some family history because it's always sparked an interest in me when I found the 1940 census, which was specifically interesting because I'd seen what I already knew, my great-grandparents, my great-aunts, my grandpa, but I also saw another name. That was John Mulvihill.
Growing up, my father had a pretty good life, I would say. I think they were better off than a lot of people, certainly that lived around them. I remember him telling us that his household was one of the first to own a television set on their street. His father was a traveling salesman but did very well, so he was away from the home, I guess, quite a bit, but at the same time was able to provide pretty well for the family. My father didn't really talk too much about his childhood. Once in a while, a little story would come up here or there, but it wasn't something that he really dwelled on too much.
So when I visited the National Archives building in New York City, we talked to an archivist there, and she said that census mistakes are actually pretty common just because of human error when someone comes to the door to ask the family. However, these mistakes are generally about incorrect ages or maybe name misspellings, and she said that it is likely or it is possible to have someone repeated on more than one census. However, it is very unlikely that someone could have been completely made up on the census.
My father never spoke about having a younger brother named John. I'm not really sure why. I'm not sure if he actually did have a brother. I find it hard to believe since it was never mentioned to me. You know, I was very close to my father's sister, Aunt Kay. She never mentioned it either. And my other aunt who lived in Ohio never came up with it, nor my other cousins. So I don't know why it was never mentioned. I assume if he did have a brother, there must have been some kind of shame associated with it, which is why it was never mentioned.
So as we contacted more family members, more theories started to emerge. Our first one was that he did something criminal and he was a shame to the family.
However, this doesn't explain why he doesn't appear in the 1930 census before the 1941. So when we were looking at the census, we noticed the question that asks what the last completed grade was. And for John Mulvihill, it says that his last completed grade was 7th grade. However, he was still enrolled in school, which leads us to believe that he was in 8th grade while he was 17. This could mean that either he was considered mentally ill, had some kind of learning disability or issue that held him back in school, and also made the family feel insecure about talking about him or uncomfortable about mentioning him, which could be why we never heard about him.
So our third theory is that John Mulvihill could have been an illegitimate child. We think this is possible because it would explain why our grandfather would either have never known about him or would have possibly felt ashamed of his father's indiscretions. Timothy Mulvihill, our great-grandfather, was a traveling salesman who had a reputation to be quite the ladies' man, so it explained if he had an affair.
When we went to the National Archives building, we found some data to support our third theory. We found on both the 1930 census and the 1940 census in Chicago, Illinois, a family named Devereaux who lived down the street from my grandpa's family. And the Devereaux family on the census was listed with everyone with the last name Devereaux except for a nephew who they said was John Mulvihill. We think that it is possible that our great-grandpa, or my grandpa and John Mulvihill's father, had an affair with Mrs. Devereaux, and that this was an illegitimate child living with the Devereaux and then also lived part of the time with the Mulvihills.
Julia Devereaux, the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Devereaux, eventually married and moved right next door, and there she raised 3 of her own children. She does have one son that's still living. His name is Reverend William Hauer, and he is still out in Chicago, and we're trying to get in touch with him right now.
You just called me. I didn't get the whole of your message, but something about someone living with my grandparents. If you want to call me back, I'll appreciate it. I'll take the call.
We were just looking for information regarding a John Mulvihill, and we were wondering if you had ever heard of him at some point. He would have possibly lived with your grandparents, Matthew and Julia Devereaux.
John Joseph Mulvihill, yes. Doing well.
A Joseph?
John Joseph.
Oh, John Joseph Mulvihill.
Well, he was John Joseph. You know, in the family, he was known as Joe.
Okay.
To his fellow police officers, he was known as John.
That's great. Thank you. Do you have any, like, how did you know him? Like, any...
Why did he live with the family?
He was my big brother, and, well, that's funny, I think. My big brother.
Okay.
He's 10 years younger than my mother.
Oh, wow, okay.
And his daddy brought him to my grandmother to raise when his wife died. And he kept the 2 older boys, Ray and Tom, and brought Joe to my grandmother to raise. And she did.
So we got a hold of Reverend William Hauer's phone number, and he told us that the John Mulvihill that we were looking for is not the John Mulvihill that he knew. John moved in with Reverend William Hauer since his father was unable to care for all 3 children and was sort of raised there, taken in as a big brother in a sort of way. This John Mulvihill moved on to become a policeman. He had a son, Michael, who's still alive today. However, he's in no relation to our John Mulvihill or any of our family members.
I think the whole situation is very fascinating, and it's very interesting to me to find out that we could have a long-lost relative that we never heard about, and that seems to kind of have disappeared off census records. We can't seem to find any death records or a birth certificate or anything. So really the only record we have of him, because no living relatives also know about him, is this 1940 census. So to me it's very interesting and fascinating, but also a bit nerve-wracking to find out that we may never know the answer.
Not knowing, honestly, makes me really confused. I thought I had known my own family, and when that was revealed to be untrue, it honestly causes quite a bit of shock in the family. Who was our grandpa? Who was our great-uncle? Who was our great-grandpa? And maybe we'll never know. And that's what keeps me up at night.